I mean, it's amazing what 10 years will do. That was a proposal that was originally brought to us by House Republican leader Larry Candelora a number of years ago, and it had wide Republican support. I will say today that we'll probably see more no votes from Republicans, not because of the concept, but I think because the way we're seeing the highly partisan activity that Democrats have engaged in when they're passing election laws. It should be a more cooperative conversation, but seeing how the early voting statutory construction played out for Connecticut without any input from stakeholders, our Secretary of State they ignored, our Registrar of Voters they ignored, House Republicans they ignored. We don't have a lot of confidence that this legislation will be done with open arms.
In terms of the Republicans, in terms of voter registration, you know as well as I do the disparity between Democrats and Republicans. It's might being reflected in the division of the legislature. Wouldn't early voting and no excuse absentee voting be advantageous to Republicans, help to get out the Republican vote, especially in statewide elections?
Yeah, it very well could. And like I said, in years past, I've supported both of those concepts. But I get very concerned when we see Democrats that don't pass legislation that incorporates the input of the stakeholders. So, for instance, we saw what happened with early voting. We were told there would be input on that statute. We're seeing it rolled out to 14 days. We don't have computers that are purchased yet. We don't know how the tabulation is going to occur. And our registrars are left with figuring out the system. There is a level of arrogance that's coming out of this building with one-party rule that isn't good for the common folk in the state of Connecticut that have to administer these procedures. So I think you're going to hear a lot of conversation today about the mechanics of how this is going to work, because frankly, I don't trust this process anymore based on the behavior of this Democrat Party.
Do you think there should be any state funding attached to expansion of absentee voting?
There has to be. I mean, there is an extreme expense to all of this for our municipalities, and it's an area that we can't afford to cut the budget, but we're leaving it all to the municipalities to try to handle. So what you may see is polls might get reduced. You might see less access to voting on election day because of budgetary constraints. So if we are going to expand voting, we need to put money into that system in order to afford it.
Where do you think will happen in terms of voting practices when no excuse absentee voting and early voting?
I mean,
do you think people still prefer to show up in the polls?
Yeah, I mean, I think with no excuse absentee balloting, people are already doing it. I don't think that will have a real big impact. You saw that uptick because of COVID, but you saw it drop right back down to normal levels. So I think people like to vote in person. I think early voting might help them do that. This resolution, I think, will have very little impact on our voter turnout, but it could be an added expense for our town. So, being the fiscal conservative Republican, we worry about the cost on our communities to administer these things.
What kind of cost do you think absentee ballots or no excuse, it's not going to change anything?
Yeah, I think no excuse ABs is probably less costly, but if we're going this route, you're going to have to print more absentee ballots. You have postage costs associated with it. We saw when they mailed to everybody, that cost the state, I think it was over $5 million that were budgeted. So there are some costs associated with this program. I'm more concerned about the underfunding of early voting. We're going to need to help our local communities with staffing, with machinery, and so that's something that we need to make a priority.
But that has already been voted on.
It has.
And so how does that play into absentee? People want early voting. I think people during the pandemic expressed that they want more options.
Yeah, I think voters certainly do want more options, but what I think is everybody wants it to go smoothly. Nobody wants stuff to be put into chaos. And so what we heard from our registrars is I can't take 14 days off from work to run a poll system. So how am I going to do this? The Secretary of State recommended 10 days. So my point to all of this is the Democrat Party, they may be in the majority, but they're not listening to the majority of people when they're passing these laws. And so that's where you're going to see opposition from Republicans. If we're going to do these things, they should be taking the recommendations of the stakeholders.
So your objection